This episode is brought to you by Early Innings, an anthology of the first 4 years of the Twin Bill. Featuring over 200 pages of baseball poetry, short stories, essays, interviews, comics, and art, it tells the story of what it means to love baseball today. The Athletic's Tyler Kepner said, like a box of ballpark Cracker Jack, there's a delightful surprise on every page of the Twin Bill's Early Innings. This is a collection to be savored, a loving and lyrical celebration of the art of baseball. Early Innings is available now from 406 Press. This episode is also brought to you by Ben Shahan's Short Relief. It asks the question of what happens when men are not ready to give up that boys' game, the national pastime. In 9 stories, he traces the stories of a minor league pitcher holding on to his last shred of hope for promotion to the show, little leaguers' formative experiences, and a host of men and boys in between. Short Relief is out on 406 Press and available at 406press.com. Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. Willie McCOVEY and Billy Williams are both Hall of Famers who are icons of 2 National League franchises. But their similarities go even deeper, as both were born in Mobile, Alabama in 1938. Jason Cannon joins us to talk about his book, A Time for Reflection, and brings new light to the arguably overlooked players. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Jason. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
So I always like to get started here by asking, where does this idea for the book come from?
Well, this book originated back in 2018. I was working on a project, my first book. On Halloween, Willie McCOVEY passes away, and I happened to be working that afternoon or that evening. I can't remember exactly, sandwiched around, kids stopping by the house, trick-or-treating and whatnot. But anyway, I came across the article, the announcement that Stretch had passed away. I grew up a Giants fan in California, and I thought, well, I had some thoughts go through my mind about, I'm a little too young. I'm 45 now, a little too young to have experienced his playing career, but very much accustomed to him being at the ballpark and being very close to the organization, charitable contributions he made, that type of thing. And I realized, well, I didn't know as much about McCOVEY as I would have liked. And so I kind of looked over at the bookshelf, and I thought, well, I'm going to just pull the book off the shelf that is about him and set it to the side. And when I finish with this, I'd like to dive in because I don't remember all the details from reading that book. I've got a number of Mays books. You've got Felipe Alou, Horace Stoneham, a recent terrific biography, and a few others that have come out in the last couple of years. But all that to say that on that night, 2018, there was no book about McCOVEY. So I thought that's kind of strange. And so I started to Google a little bit, and nothing came up. And so I thought I would really like to dive into this project. I need to look more into this if possible down the road. And so I wrote a little sticky Post-it note and put it on my desk. And it sat there for a long time, and there wasn't a book on McCOVEY. And so we get about 2019, 2020, COVID hits and things of that nature. And so I took that time to dive into reading secondary sources. So whether that's about the teams of that decade or the Mays books or a variety of texts about his teammates and Marichal, of course, Cepeda as well. And just to learn as much about McCOVEY that I could. I spent a long time going through different books. Anyway, long story, I guess longer. I said, I got to really figure out if this is a project I could work on. So that was the genesis of the McCOVEY interest. Well, throughout that process, my first book, which is about a former owner of the Chicago Cubs when they won the 2 World Series titles and 4 pennants at the turn of the 20th century, got to meet some really nice people with the Cubs organization and connect over that. And they approached me at one point about doing some work with Billy Williams because of the stories that he had and of course, the wonderful career and impact on the organization that he had. I said, well, of course, absolutely. And I thought, well, maybe this is the project to work on because there's this connection. It was off and running. Well, when I started to do a little research and kind of dig around, they were born a few miles apart in 1938. They made their major league debut in 1959. They both essentially developed these tremendous reputations as pillars of their communities in San Francisco and Chicago. They go into the Hall of Fame 1 year apart, 86 and 87. And they're both girl dads. These parallels started to emerge. And I thought, well, maybe this is something where they're interwoven enough from a life standpoint, but also from, they Joe Malfitano told me at one point they came out of the same mold from a personality perspective. And kind of the final um, moment where I said, I really think I'd like to do a work on these two guys together was I found out that down in Mobile, they're working on a Hall of Fame courtyard where they're building statues of their baseball Hall of Famers. And of course, Mobile, Alabama, more baseball Hall of Famers per capita than any city in the US. And so I thought, well, this is an ending that writes itself with the unveiling of this statue courtyard. And so that was kind of the process that unfolded over the course of several months and where the project started and how it began as an intertwining of both McCovey and Williams.
You mentioned you grew up a Giants fan. During the research process, I'm sure you got to talk to all sorts of interesting people. Was there anyone you were really excited to get to talk to?
Well, growing up during the 1980s, of course, my baseball hero was Will Clark. So the opportunity to talk to the Thrill about McCovey was really special. That was a terrific conversation. They were close. And they, obviously Mac 44, Clark 22. There's a symmetry with the numbers. Left-handed playing first base at Candlestick Park. Neat conversations. And I think one of the things that I remember growing up was nobody wanted to be in the big moments more than Will Clark. He thrived when the pressure was most intense. And through the course of our conversation, he talked about advice he got from Willie McCovey about being in those moments, about embracing them, about, there's the crowd, but then there's a channeling of your focus and of your energy. And so to kind of come full circle with what I knew of him on the field to working on this project and hearing about his conversations with Mac and Mac's influence on his approach in those moments was really special. Of course, two tremendous hitters, and now their numbers are retired, rightfully so. In close proximity in the upper left field decks there at Oracle Park.
How did Billy feel about the project?
Billy was great. We did a number of interviews together in different situations, which lent themselves to a variety of conversations. And I hope that comes through in the book. For example, the first interview we did together was at the Cubs headquarters there, just across the little walkway from Wrigley Field. And we talked a lot about growing up in Mobile and his early careers as well as his career highlights. And then we had another conversation in Cooperstown the weekend during which Buck O'Neil was inducted into the Hall of Fame, which was kind of the genesis of our conversation, focusing primarily on Buck O'Neil and Billy's long-term relationship with Buck. And another conversation, it kind of came up because, of course, Billy ended his career playing for the Oakland A's, and we started having one of our conversations, and I was just curious his thoughts on, the Oakland A's ownership situation and, them possibly moving and playing in Oakland and all of that type of thing, just to see what his thoughts were. And that moved into a conversation about his time in Oakland and rooming next to Reggie Jackson, his relationship with Mr. October. And so those different environments, if you will, or those kind of the contexts being a little bit different, lent themselves, I think, really well to different stories and different moments in his career. And hopefully that comes through in the book. He is really incredible to talk to. His memory is unbelievable. And he's incredibly funny, which I don't know that people in general really know. He's absolutely hilarious. He's a wonderful storyteller. He connects people in a special way. He knows everybody. He's revered, and rightfully so, by all those who know him. And it was a really special experience to get to talk to him.
For me, looking at this without reading the book at first, I'm like, okay, McCovey, Billy Williams, overlap playing. Yeah, I don't necessarily see the connection right away. Did he understand where you were coming from with this idea of a book about the two of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at first, starting with myself, it's kind of like, is this a good idea? Because essentially you've got to, prove that it is, that there's worthy connections. I think the answer is yes. And here's what I think where that stems from and kind of what motivated me. And after having a couple conversations, I went, okay, let's move forward with this approach, which was the players from Mobile share an incredibly special connection. And Mr. Aaron, Henry Aaron, of course, Mr. Aaron, kind of the elder statesman of the group, about four years older or so than both Willie and Billy. Willie's 6 months older, born in 38, as I mentioned earlier. And then you have a group of players who's a little bit younger. You have Mr. Aaron's younger brother, you have Tommy Aaron. You have of course, Cleon Jones, you have Amos Otis, tremendous players. And in fact, Billy told me a couple times, some of the really, really good players who, could compete at that level as well, they just made different career choices. They went into the military, or maybe they started a family. They just had different things going on in life. But that the competition down there was incredible, and the skill level was off the charts, and they worked extremely hard. They competed against each other. So when I was hearing these stories, I thought the approach I want to take here is, let's look to a certain degree at the history of baseball in Mobile. Let's look at Mobile itself, socially, culturally, politically, through the lens of their stories. And I think when it's looked at that way, especially with kind of the closing of the arc later in the book with the development of the statue courtyard there on the waterfront, I think once that idea emerged and kind of crystallized, and I shared that with him and with others, it made a lot of sense. And so that's what encouraged me to kind of take a little bit of a unique approach. You're not going to see a ton of books that look like this in terms of approach, and I hope it works. I think it works, but that was kind of how it emerged, and how those conversations went.
It is fascinating that so many players came out of, I mean, not a small area, but relatively a small area where a lot of them knew each other and things like that. Do you have any sense for why Mobile, of all places, happened to be this sort of hotbed for baseball talent?
It's a great question. The kind of the saying that goes around that is often attributed to Mr. Aaron. I'm sure he said it as well. There's something in the water, and they kind of laugh and joke and have this wonderful sense about things. But I think when we kind of drilled down and really looked at it, there were a couple of different things. But number one was they all played a game called Tops, and Tops was a game where you would take essentially a broomstick handle, perhaps a mop handle, and then you would find soda, the bottle caps that came off of sodas, which down there in the heat of the summer were, people were constantly buying drinks, and in the dispenser, they would snap off the bottle cap, and those would remain in the pouch of the machines. Well, they would collect these caps to play Tops, and people at the stores got to know the kids. And so, for example, I know in the down the Bay neighborhood, the McCoveys would work. There was a corner store, Miss Savannah ran it. They would help her with chores around the store, and then she would feed them sandwiches and give them the caps that customers had left behind, and they would go out and play Tops. Well, they would throw and spin and curve and manipulate these caps as they pitched constantly, and they became experts at it. Well, it required you to really develop your hand-eye coordination to hit those spinning bottle caps with a broomstick handle. And I know at one point there was, I believe it was in Henry Aaron's autobiography, I Had a Hammer, he talks about even when he was a big leaguer, his power was generated in a different way. He was almost, if memory recalls, more on his front foot than his back leg, because you had to get out there and make contact with the ball a little bit earlier. But that was a direct consequence of having played Tops, because you wanted to get out there and make contact with the cap before it spun that final time. And this is a game that was played all throughout the area. So Williams up in Whistler played it with his friends. McCovey down the Bay played it, and I think that this game in particular stands out to them as one of the. They all learned to hit. They all learned to hit, and this game was at the center of all of that.
Before we go much further here, I wanted to ask you about the title, A Time for Reflection. Where does that title come from?
It comes from Billy Williams' Hall of Fame speech, and the title it's a long title, and I wrestled with that quite a bit, but there were a couple things about the title that I really wanted to do, or to make sure we're included. There are some very famous, and rightfully so, some very famous speeches in baseball history, and as well there should be. Lou Gehrig's Luckiest Man, Jackie Robinson before the World Series at Riverfront Stadium. When I heard Billy Williams' Hall of Fame speech that he delivered there on those steps in 1987, I was overwhelmed with emotion. It is a powerful, powerful speech, and you can find it pretty easily and find the transcripts of it. And in that speech, he talks about how baseball has reached a moment where, a time to reflect on the progress of racial integration in the game, but how far the game still has to go. And it moved me in a deep way, to the point where I thought, the number one thing I want people to learn about Billy Williams is his strength of character. And I thought by titling the book A Time for Reflection, hopefully will encourage people, such as, as you just did, to ask, well, what does this have to do with playing baseball? Well, it doesn't, and it has to do with something much larger than that. And so that's where the title comes from. And I hope it encourages people to watch that speech. And we write about it extensively in the book and get his daughter's reaction to that speech. He has a reputation for being more on the quiet side, as does Mac. And I understand it to a certain degree, because when, let's say you share a clubhouse with Ernie Banks, Ernie's going to be the more extroverted personality. But Billy Williams, I don't know that I would ever categorize him as shy or quiet or anything along those lines. If you ask him a question, he'll answer it. He's a wonderful storyteller. And in this moment, he used his platform for this moment to ask baseball to reflect. And I think hopefully this book will bring that a little bit more attention on that part of his life story, and we can learn a lot from his wise words.
So I wanted to get into their playing careers now a little bit. They were really a part of the second, maybe third wave of black players to come to the major leagues. What were their experiences like, especially coming up and reaching the majors?
Well, they both dealt with a substantial amount of racism. It's in the book. I chronicled both some primary source information, both from interviews and things like that, but I also dug into some of the newspaper archives and quoted the way they were described. And they're very deeply troubling descriptions of the McCOVEY. I'm thinking of one story in particular, the way he moved and looked and behaved, and frequently they were labeled by those in and around their careers in the minor leagues now, especially. They didn't hustle after fly balls. They were essentially pegged as lazy. And this was a stereotype of some of these players from Mobile. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And yet that was just an easy way to label. McCOVEY dealt with, of course, a ton of injuries. And I think at one point in the book, I just try to point out, without being too over the top about it, like, so a guy who plays hurt, especially to this degree, you're telling me that, he doesn't want to compete at the highest level. So it just doesn't add up. Billy Williams had a tremendous consecutive game streak, set the National League record during his big league career, played through all kinds of injuries. At one point, cuts the toe box out of his cleat so that his swollen toes can find space to fit. I mean, it's really, outrageous, some of these labels, especially in the minor leagues. And, the abuse that they took, I took a toll. And, at one point, Billy Williams left and went back to Mobile. And the Cubs found out about this, of course, very quickly and sent Buck O'Neill to talk to Billy. And he did. And Billy rejoined the organization. And, the rest, I guess you could say, is history. But, what's also history is what caused him to leave and what he went through when he was pondering going back, and very much a part of their experience. And so this idea that once Jackie Robinson broke into the big leagues, well, it was smooth sailing from there. I mean, that's a fallacy that couldn't be further from the truth.
They both kind of burst onto the scene. They both win Rookie of the Year. Incredibly, Willie McCOVEY does it in 52 games. That's mind-blowing to me that he made that much of an impact. I think I looked it up. He put up like 2 WAR in 52 games or something like that. It's unreal. But after that, McCOVEY in particular has a little bit more complicated start to his career. He doesn't really have a full season until almost 4 years later. Because there's another guy there who is also a Hall of Famer, Orlando Cepeda. What is that relationship like between the two?
They got along great personally. In fact, they were essentially neighbors for a while there, living in the city. They got along really well personally. In fact, they met at McCOVEY's tryout in Melbourne, Florida. When we sat down with Cepeda to talk to him about that, he remembered seeing, McCOVEY in line. I mean, he's this tall guy who, I think he had, if our memory serves, a blue cap, and he just stood out, of course, and just hit line drives all over the place, and so caught everyone's attention. At least after the first day or so, he initially struggled a little bit, but they had a great relationship personally. But yeah, it was a thing where the Giants organization could not figure out how to play them together. And when you think about that, it's, you got to do it. You got to figure it out. You have to figure it out. And the two things when I think about McCovey's power numbers in particular, two things just kind of strike me after kind of taking a step back and thinking about all this. He hit 521 home runs. How many at bats did he lose in the first, 3 or 4 years of his career? He's hitting 600. If he plays any other game, he's playing at the stick. He loses how many, right? And so the injuries, right? He's easily a 600 home run guy, and he's just thought of differently because the reality is these guys who hit 6 are viewed differently than guys who hit 5, and not in a crazy way, but you hit 6, that's a little bit different. And even though he retired having homered more than any other left-handed hitter in National League history, you think about, there's a little hint of what might have been, and he lost so many at bats. Now it just didn't affect their relationship at all. They were very close. They were friends. In fact, they both had to deal with racist experiences. They leaned on each other. They helped each other. And then finally, Cepeda's traded, of course. But it was kind of captured in my conversation with Juan Marichal. Marichal at one point kind of just sighed and went, "Could you imagine if we had had the designated hitter?" And it was just, it was a poignant moment of just, almost a little bit of what might have been if we could just figured out a way to get both those guys those at bats. At the end of the day, it didn't happen, and obviously Cepeda's traded.
I did have to bring up the 1962 World Series. I've seen it before. I just pulled it up again. What happens in that Game 7? How does McCOVEY, how do the players describe what happens in that moment there?
Well, it's interesting because not a single person I talked to expected McCOVEY to be pitched to. And also, notably in that at bat, McCOVEY drilled a ball foul down the right field line. Well, as part of that, Bobby Richardson's observing that swing. He pulls the ball down the right field line into this well into the stands, But Richardson told me at that point he's decided, I'm going to move a couple steps to my left. And so he does. And obviously McCOVEY hits the rocket right at him, and that's the end of the World Series. And the thing that stood out to me in writing this is, or one of the things it did is, McCovey's most famous at bat is an out. Like, really? Like, can we insert a few more stories, a few more accomplishments on or off the field, whether in micro or macro form, to at least put something alongside that at bat? But I think Peanuts, of course, Charlie laments the out, and it kind of takes on this life of its own. And then the Giants don't win, of course, until 2010, and so that's part of it too. Is just the opportunity. But that ball, if it gets through, they win. There was a really great story that Bobby Richardson told me when they got back together years later. The Yankees and Giants are playing an interleague series, and so the Giants invite Bobby Richardson out. And so at first he's like, I'm not sure. And anyway, he decides to go, and he was really glad he did. He sits down with Mac at a banquet the night before, and they shake hands, and Mac tells him, "Why, I bet your hand still hurts." And they share a laugh about that. And then interestingly, and I think it says a lot about kind of the class that McCOVEY had. A few months before McCOVEY passed away, Richardson receives a manila envelope in his mail, and he opens it up, and it's a photograph of McCOVEY, but it's signed to Richardson. It says, "To my friend." And it's kind of a beautiful moment there of just full circle of, perhaps McCovey's one of his greatest professional disappointments, that at bat, turns into a moment of personal, joy and friendship and kindness. And that really encapsulates the man, I think. So, yeah, absolutely part of the story. Has to be, but hopefully some other things along the way. And I thought that was a great way to kind of close the book, how he turned that into essentially a warm and kind and, magnanimous friendship with Bobby Richardson.
I'm going to give you a chance to rewrite the narrative for him here. What would you want his defining moment to be instead of making it out in the 62 World Series?
I think that's a great question. I think a couple things stand out. The first one that stands out is you could put together a whole chapter that would strictly be an oral history of people describing how far the ball went when he hit it. And you could start when he was a teenager and go all the way through to the end of his career, essentially. We're just talking about incredible power, just incredible power. And I think that would be where I would start as far as his reputation as a ball player, because people did not want to pitch to him, and they, weren't always sure how to get him out. And if he made contact, the ball was going a long way. And I was having a conversation with Bill North, for example. Bill North, outfielder with both Chicago and San Francisco. And Bill North, he emphasized to me one thing that you really need to really try to understand is that both McCovey and Williams, they were doing these things when pitchers wanted no part of them, absolutely no part of them. And they still did this damage at the plate. And so I think that's as far as on the field where I would start with McCovey. Also a better defender than people perhaps give him credit for. The other aspect is his work with the Giants organization. So the junior Giants, the stretch drive, the charitable involvement, his willingness to lend his name and be involved, not just kind of as a spectator, but to get involved, meet people, meet and greets, this kind of thing, to make sure that kids had equipment. And I think that stems from perhaps not having some of the equipment when he was their age, wanting to make sure they had it. And I know a few people told me Mac would address the team. He'd go into the clubhouse and address the team and say, hey, this charitable event's very important to me, and I appreciate everybody's involvement in it. And I just wanted to personally express my appreciation, but also, share with you that it means a lot to me that we're doing this. And those are a couple things that really stand out that I think should be the headlines of his career on and off the field.
Same question for Billy Williams.
Billy was a tremendous hitter. Early in his career in the minor leagues, he would hit the ball the other way a lot. And then as he put on strength, he could pull the ball. And obviously when he got to big leagues, what a tremendous hitter he was. I think very similar stories with Billy. I think he was such an important part of the community, great player, consistency, uncommon consistency. If you bought a ticket to watch the Cubs play, Billy Williams was in the lineup. And chances are Billy collected a couple of hits and did something to help Chicago win the game that day. The other thing about Billy is in the clubhouse, he was a glue guy for sure. He led by example. His work ethic was tremendous. And I think the results that people saw on the field, that's important. But the work that he put in behind the scenes to perform at that level is really quite extraordinary and worthy of tremendous conversation. He would watch film. It strikes me as almost a conversation you'd have today with coaches and players and stuff, but they would watch reels of film and he would identify whether his back shoulder location on his swing and if he was, making good contact, but they would watch those reels. And he was at the heart of that. He was friends with everybody. He was a leader without having to be maybe as vocal as some of the others, but he absolutely in his own right was. And he was a special player for them. I think the other stuff off the field, he contributed to the organization, still does. He's very much a presence at the ballpark. There's a really quite a story. Lee Smith was a reliever in the minor leagues, and Lee Smith was a starter, but they were thinking about moving him to the bullpen. And in those days, the bullpen was not nearly as well, it wasn't really celebrated at all like we think of in today's game. But all that to say that Billy went down and had a conversation with Lee Smith and said, hey, I think this is part of where the game's going. Don't leave, don't give up on your dream, but it may look a little different. And Lee agrees to stay and to try it, and then goes on to have a Hall of Fame career as a closer. And there's a really sweet moment during Lee Smith's Hall of Fame acceptance speech where he turns to Billy, who's sitting, on the stage, but behind him, and he thanks Billy for that conversation, which is a key moment of leadership in Lee Smith's career. So I think those are some of the kind of the behind the scenes stories about Billy that really jump out at me that are absolutely part of his legacy.
Obviously, they both had incredible Hall of Fame careers. I think outside of San Francisco and Chicago, they're a little bit underappreciated. Maybe, you play with Willie Mays, you play with Ernie Banks, you're going to kind of get overshadowed a little bit there. But I think that most people now, if you're going to ask them about McCovey or Billy Williams, especially younger people, they would know McCovey because of McCovey Cove. And that kind of came after a tough period between him and the organization. Any idea what went on there? And then what did McCovey Cove do for that relationship?
It's a great question. Some people were not exactly sure what went into that. But yeah, there was distance there, and there was an intentional conversation between Larry Baer and McCovey that led to, I think the way Larry framed it was, let's agree to agree. We both want to, reconnect and rebuild this relationship. And then the credit for McCovey Cove in terms of naming it goes to a local columnist who had this wonderful idea, Mark Purdy, who thought, well, McCovey needs to be honored in a special way. And it kind of made sense where the park was being built on the water, and that area the ocean essentially. That's where McCovey would have hit a lot of home runs, and they agreed. And it's a wonderful tribute. And I think McCovey was obviously very touched. And yeah, things healed up nicely. And so you look back and you kind of never know that there was a little bit of tension during those few years, but there was, and I think everybody kind of acknowledges that, and then simultaneously is like acknowledging that yeah, they worked things out, and the communication was good after that, and then McCovey was there, a lot, right? He was there. Obviously, the health issues played a role later on, but he was there and involved all the time, and it was a wonderful relationship at that point.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's the coolest honor you can get. Having McCovey Cove, my gosh, that's legendary. That's amazing. Yeah.
You've got part of a map named after you. That's
Yeah.
pretty legit.
That's very, very cool. We talked a little bit about how one team had a very long drought for the World Series. The other one had a pretty long drought for the World Series. What did those World Series wins mean to the two of the players?
Meant a lot. McCovey received rings, some very special moments, and obviously both were involved right in the process and were able to attend some events in conjunction with those World Series. I guess the four of them between the two players, the two organizations, very special. I think it's interesting. Billy Williams attended the games and was part of that. And after the Cubs won, there were a lot of people in and around the organization that were thrilled for him and approached him and wanted to have a moment with him. Crane Kenny told me this. They wanted to almost have a moment with Williams to celebrate and to enjoy and to kind of see his reaction to this win, and that it was just a special thing for everybody involved that they had won, of course, right, for themselves, but also for the past generations. And I think that rings true for both men. Another parallel, if you will. I think for Mac, obviously they win 3 times. Health started to play a role in those years too, but in a way he didn't have to talk about 62 as much, or the context of the whole thing changed because they had won, and there it wasn't the last out of game 7 anymore. It's an easy narrative, right? And so, but you can kind of dump it a little bit, at least hopefully. You talk about something else, and winning's the best thing. And then the organizations, I think, were thrilled to include both of them as well as the players in those moments.
I've got one more for you here. You're a high school teacher. I don't remember any of my high school teachers writing a baseball book. I would have been super excited about this. How do the kids feel about this? Are they aware? Do they know? Are they excited? How's the reaction there?
That's a great question. Well, I teach a special group of kids, and they actually, when the book came out a couple weeks ago, they had kind of planned a little something in one of the rooms down the hall, and got me to walk in there and celebrated it with a little bit of a little surprise release fiesta, and it was very sweet. You work with kids and you want to so desperately encourage them to achieve what it is that they want. And life isn't always going to go this way or that, right? There's twists and turns, but I always wanted to write. I wanted to be a journalist when I was their age. And it's fine that I'm not, but you get to do it in different ways. Get to celebrate a couple things. Number one, you hope that they can see what you're doing and then know that they can always grind and work hard to achieve what they want. But then the other part of it is, you hopefully invest in them in a way that they're happy for your success. And that's what they showed that. And I'm very lucky that way. There aren't maybe a lot of moments where you have like that with your kids, and I'm very fortunate to have had that. And so I've got a great group, and that was a day I will not forget. It was just a very selfless, kind thing for them to do, I suppose, that they also could just see an example of, hey, keep doing it, keep pursuing it, and you can accomplish whatever you want. I mean, who am I? I'm just some random schlep. You just have to find ideas. If you work hard, you can do it.
That was Jason Cannon. His book, A Time for Reflection, The Parallel Legacies of Baseball Icons Willie McCovey and Billy Williams, is out now. Coming on to close us out is Robert Eugene Rubino, reading his poem, They Didn't Play Polo at the Polo Grounds, from our 19th issue.
They Didn't Play Polo at the Polo Grounds, by Robert Eugene Rubino. If he had gone to Yankee Stadium when he was a kid in the 1930s, he would have become a Yankees fan, idolizing Babe and the Iron Horse and Joltin' Joe. And if he had taken his 6-year-old son to the stadium in 1954, his son would have become a Yankees fan, idolizing Mickey and Yogi. But when he was a kid in the 30s, he'd gone to the Polo Grounds to root for McGraw's Giants with Hubble and Terry and Ott, and he became a Giants fan. And he took his loyalty crazy serious as loyalty to family, church, country. So in 1954, he took his 6-year-old son to the Polo Grounds, where polo wasn't ever played, and the boy would idolize the Say Hey Kid. And if the father possessed a more flexible version of loyalty, he would have turned his back on the Giants after the '57 season, when they and the Dodgers gave New York a middle finger farewell, and maybe he would have become a Yankees fan, or bide his time and in due course embrace the Mets. But his loyalty to the Giants was made of stronger, sterner, certainly more stubborn stuff. And so through the next 5.5 decades of the rest of his life, he remained a Giants fan, insisting they were merely on the longest road trip in the history of road trips, insisting they'd return to their birthplace, not merely occasionally as a visitor, but for good, also eventually insisting his grown-up son would return one day to that same birthplace, the son who through the years regarded his father's loyalties as ludicrous, laughable, embarrassing, but finally laudable, even noble, in an uncomplicated, straight from the heart sort of way.
We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. Until next time,